everyone, welcome back to Novel Nomad and welcome to my Victober Wrap-Up. I had such an amazing reading month I should say, for Victober this year, and I got through 8 books and that is quite remarkably awesome. I think I did a really good pace throughout. I did falter towards the end a bit. I think I got too deep into the Victorian book I had previously read and found it very hard to get into the next one. But all in all, it was a fantastic reading month. So let's just quickly go through the books that I have read and my thoughts on them. So first off, I read Black Beauty by Agnes Gray, and this was actually amazingly good. It was a really interesting book. It was from the horse's perspective, so as a young colt and what he remembers of his life and all the things that happened to him, leaving the farm, going into service at a more wealthier house, and then all the horrible things and the treatment that he received and how he moved on in the world and how horses were traded and bartered, and he had lots of stories from other horses as well, but also other animals. So what this book really was about is about animal rights, and it's against animal cruelty, which you can tell given the fact that Agnes was greatly injured in her youth, and she often had to have a horse and trap to take her around many places. She often saw how animals were being mistreated, and this is a really lovely book. I didn't cry. It was really heartbreaking towards the end, but I think what is more heartbreaking for me is the fact that a book like this that was written in 1870s is still relevant today for animal rights and treatment of animals as well. So I really thoroughly recommend. I know for some people it might be hard reading from an animal's perspective, but she does it so well and it just feels really organic, like a very Victorian voice. Next, I read something ridiculously hilarious, and that was 3 Men in a Boat. And this is so Monty Python-esque. It's so fabulous to see where this British humour comes from. This was like a sensation when it first came out, one of the first comic novels. He followed it up with 3 Men in Brummel, or on a Brummel, but this one still remains to be the most popular, and you can see why. There were so many times I was laughing out loud. I could not believe some of the things the characters were saying, and it's so true. There's so many sentiments that they share about their friends and each other that is just so hilarious. So this was actually a really fun read. It was very different from many Victorian novels, which are all about social change and social classes and all these issues within society, where this is just pure fun. I also read Agnes Gray. This is a tiny little edition, but Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. I did read Tenant of Wildfell Hall last year for Victober, and I wanted to read her other work because these are her 2 main works, and this is the one that Charlotte Bronte wanted to have republished and her sister to be remembered for, because she felt that Tenant of Wildfell Hall was too challenging for society to be, well, I mean, appreciated. That's how I feel anyway. But Agnes Gray is really beautiful. It's about a young girl whose family falls on hard times, so she decides, instead of constantly being considered the younger daughter who just has to sit back and let the mum and the older sister do everything, she wants to go out in the world and make her own money and help the family in her own way. So she becomes a governess, and this one is definitely illustrating how horrendous governesses were treated, like absolutely horrendous, because she goes into multiple positions as well. And it's also how children are being treated, how different parents expect different things, and there's different levels of involvement, of course, from the parents, but the way they treat the children and then disregard them at the same time, it's as if they're doing like a princess mode, but also something that they don't want around. It's very hard for the child to understand where their place is in society or within the family dynamic. And of course the governess falls between that really awkward, not part of the family but not part of the servants, and you could really feel that tension running through. But there's also a really adorable love story towards the end, so definitely keep reading for all the horrible things that happen and all those awful children that are in it. I really love this book. It's such a short read as well. It's so wonderful. Okay, so a reread for me was The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy, and I can definitely see in light of other Hardys that I have read, this one's a great one to start with because he's so bold. He's so bold with all his themes, his characters. They're so outrageously eccentric, and they're like the nth degree of themselves. There's no subtleties in this book, but it's really amazing how he manages to craft and weave that story. I couldn't believe how much I had forgotten. I knew the bare basics of what happened, but this was just so much fun to read again. I whipped through this really fast. And if you're starting Hardy, I actually recommend Mayor of Casterbridge, because if you can read this and kind of get a taste of Hardy's writing and his love of the descriptive and how beautiful he weaves things through the nature, then I think you're going to love the rest of Hardy. But yeah, I definitely recommend Mayor of Casterbridge as a starting point. Next, I read Little Lord Fauntleroy by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I found out after reading this falls outside the Victoria period by 4 years. This was published in 1905. I only picked this up because I'd read Secret Garden and The Little Princess, both of which are published in Victober period. But unfortunately this falls just outside into the Edwardian period, but it feels very Victorian, so I kept it in anyway, but I'd already read it. It was very, very sweet. I did like the fact that the parents were very active in the life, and you just had that, how the little boy is just seen to be who he is, and he's respected for that. And not only respected, but he acts like it. He is very much the Little Lord. He thinks about things. He sits and he thinks, and he wonders how best to make people's lives, because everyone should have a lovely life regardless of who they are. So it really was such a lovely read. It was just a wonderful palate cleanser between all these very dramatic reads. Next was The Doctor's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and I was shocked by how much I love this. I buddy read this with the lovely Kate Howe, who I buddy read The Lady Audley's Secret with, and this was fantastic. I am quite surprised. Like, Lady Audley's Secret is a sensationalist novel, and you can definitely tell that by the structure, by the emotion, by the characterization. But The Doctor's Wife is a lot subtler, and it does have some comic elements which help push the story along very much in the early stages of the writing. But it really follows about a young girl who's just been left to her own devices, and she's been allowed complete freedom and to kind of hide away from the world and not wanting to face the realities of it. And in doing so, she gives herself over to novels, and it kind of feeds on later on that she romanticizes the sensationalist novel kind of hero, which is, you know, he will die for his love, and when people think she's actually quite wicked, she's not. She just has this kind of she just wants to escape away into this other world. But also at the same time, it's not illustrating that novels are evil. It's not doing that at all. It's allowing her to see things from a different point of view. And when she suddenly starts to realize that things within the real life do have to have their precedence as well, she starts to illustrate this great change. And by the end of the book, she has amazing agency. So I just really loved how this book turned out. It was such a fantastic read, and I really liked, there was definitely very different usage of words and sentence phrases within this. You could see that it wasn't as meticulously crafted, say, as a Hardy novel, and it wasn't as high pitch, but it definitely has some really fantastic words that was really fascinating and very refreshing to read within a Victorian novel. Alright, so the big one, the one that I binged within 3 days. I read this in 3 days. I could not put it down. But then I had a solid week after, almost 4 or 5 days of just recovery time. I couldn't really pick up anything else because it just had such an effect on me. And that's Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Now, this one's a hard one to really describe. I utterly adore it. I think it definitely has a place within Victorian writing, and it definitely has a place within writing of women, because unlike Jane Eyre and unlike many characters that really describe where their emotions and their emotional turmoil and emotional development have come from. Lucy Snow is someone who deeply buries all of her emotions, and to an extent that she can be quite critical and vicious towards other people, but at the same time she shows such a softness and a desperation of character trying to reach out to other people. So Lucy Snow is orphaned. You meet her first off with her godmother, and she meets these two characters, and so she's I believe she's orphaned because she doesn't have any family a few chapters later on, but you don't know why, what happened and what's going on. Presumably she's left quite destitute. She doesn't have very much money. She has to go out in the world and make her own money, and in that case an old lady in the area where she grew up asked her to be a companion, which she is, and she's wonderfully kind to her, but she can't quite get through to Lucy. Lucy's still very insular and she can't quite express her emotions well. And so when the old lady dies, she decides to try her luck in France and goes to Villette, where she becomes an English teacher at a school. Well, not at first, but she eventually does. And there she meets a young doctor and also an older man who's a professor. He's in his 40s. And how these two men impact upon her life and bring out some of herself and some of the emotion and try to really get beneath. It was just beautiful, and I really thoroughly enjoyed reading this. I can understand why it can be such a divide, but I feel like there's such a subtlety of desperation in the writing, because at this point Charlotte Bronte was writing, all her family had died, her sisters had passed away, and so had her brother by this point. So you can feel in the writing she's not angry, she's just constantly seeking something. She's constantly seeking some solace from her loneliness, and Lucy Snow is very much like that. So I really sympathise with Lucy Snow, and it was very emotional, and it was very hard to pick up anything else because I kept thinking about this book. So I do thoroughly recommend, but just be sure when you go into it, you're not going to get the bright, vivacious character that is Jane from Jane Eyre. You're definitely going to get a more reserved and very, very closed off and more analytical character, but one who has the potential for great emotion, and it's simmering there under the surface, just waiting to be tempted out by the right person. So lastly, what I managed to finish within the last, I think, 2 days of October was Ruth by Elizabeth Gaskell. And I really, really enjoyed this one. This was really good fun. It was a classic Victorian story of the fallen woman. And Elizabeth Gaskell had a really interesting, well, really beautiful writing for one. But it was more on the way of the main character, Ruth, was always made to feel repentant for her actions, and she always was putting herself in harm's way almost, because it was almost as if, you know, something unknown to her she did without any guidance or without anyone offering her assistance, that those early choices allowed her to then almost make her life not forfeit, but to have a different opinion on who she is and what her value is in life. But I really loved the characters, supporting characters around a really great ensemble that managed to really support and structure the story. But what I do love as well, that really made the story for me, because if this wasn't part of the story, I probably would have had a lot of difficulty reading this, and that was the sins of the mother was not reflected on the child. It would have been in general society. It was arguing for the fact that a child, when they're born innocent, they're born unknowing into the world, and therefore whatever happened in there to be conceived shouldn't actually reflect upon the child, because they are yet untested, untried, and have little to no experience of the social expectations. So I really, really enjoyed that part. I think that was a very strong and constant message that Jack Gaskell was reiterating throughout this book. But yeah, it did feel very repentful throughout it for Ruth, but she still had a beautiful quality of life within the family that she created and found. Okay, so they're the books I read, and now it's confession time. Because I didn't finish Our Mutual Friend. I actually barely got into it. I really only read about 2 chapters and everything else took over. And then I was going to read it after Villette, and then Villette happened, and I couldn't quite pick it up. So because it was just so intense. And a Dickens, I know I have to give my full mind, heart, and soul to if I'm going to really get into it. So I had to go with Ruth because it was a shorter book, and Gaskell is a very beautiful writer and has lots of gentleness surrounding her writing, where Dickens can be quite cynical and sharp. So this is going to be my challenge for next year. I want to finish it before Victober, so I'm going to start now, and hopefully I can get this done before Victober next year, so I can finally get this off my TBR shelf, and I can choose another Dickens for Victober next year. Alright, so that were all the books I read during Victober. Let me know your favourite book that you read, or if you want to talk about any of these in particular, I'm happy to do so in the comments down below. But I hope you all have a wonderful day, happy reading, and I'll see you next time. Bye!